Hi, good evening, everyone. We're just going to wait 2 minutes till we have all the other participants join in. In the meantime, listen to this beautiful new song by Lifafa called Pari. Hi, good evening. Good evening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed both of those songs. The first one was Pari by Lifafa, and the second one was by Peter Cat Recording, Piano something, I forget. But just to start us off, I just wanted to welcome you to the webinar and to invite you to today's session, which is Exhibition Histories with Aditi Rakhe. To quickly introduce TIFA Working Studios is a multidisciplinary space sorry, just a second, I had some admin stuff. TIFA Working Studios is a multidisciplinary center for creativity and culture based in India. This is some events that we're pivoting to, and we're moving to digital since our physical space has been shut for the last 2 months since the lockdown. We have been doing events, exhibitions, workshops, webinars, and are completely multidisciplinary. We started in 2014. To quickly introduce the session today, we have Aditi Rakhe, and we've collaborated with Sahapedia, the Museums of India project, for this session to take place. A little bit about the event. Although art history is long sustained, exhibition history is a very small but rapidly expanding part thereof. Aditi's lecture will focus on the histories of display culture as an extension of the history of art. The presentation will predominantly address the definition, types, and purpose of exhibitions through history, apart from questions such as how have exhibitions and their designs evolved? What have their socio-cultural connotations been? What is the white cube? What is curation? And what is the role, what role does it play in exhibition histories? To quickly introduce Aditi as well, with a Bachelors in Architecture from S.C.E.T, Surat, and an MA in History of Art from the University of Nottingham, United Kingdom, Aditi Rakhe has been involved with a diverse set of exhibitions across India and the UK. As a curator and exhibition designer and manager, her professional journey started on foreign grounds with Crop Up Gallery, University of Nottingham, and the Aftermath project with Nottingham Contemporary in the UK, but eventually led her back to her roots in India, where she worked with the Museum of Goa as a museum coordinator and a co-curator and project manager for the Goa Affordable Art Festival. Subsequently, she joined TIFA Working Studios in Pune as the programs manager and is also the festival curator for the Futures of Sexuality Festival. She presently works as a project coordinator for the Museums of India project at Sahapedia. So I will now hand over to Aditi Rakhe to take you through the session. Welcome, Aditi.
Thank you, Trishna. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I hope all of you are having a good evening. And the lockdown is not getting to you too much. Just to start with, I wanted to introduce Sahapedia and Museums of India. So Sahapedia is an open encyclopedic resource of arts, cultures, and histories of India. It offers digital content in multimedia format, which means we have articles, books, photo essays, videos, almost anything under the book. And how we go about it is we have multiple authors create this content for us, which we curate then on our website, which you can check out later on. Specifically within Sahapedia, I work for the Museums of India project, which brings together museums, heritage, and communities to create a participatory ecosystem of museum exploration. The attempt is to create sustainable community engagements via museum experiences and to develop linkages between various stakeholders in the museum ecosystem. This digital platform is a one-stop, all-inclusive resource of all museums of India, where audiences can view consolidated information about 4,400 plus museums from 40 plus cities across India. Museums of India and Sahapedia are also doing a campaign for International Museums Day, which is going to happen on the 18th of May, Monday. The campaign is kickstarting with this particular event, and there'll be more later on. So please do check out our website for more details. I'm just going to let Trishna take over for a second before I move on to my presentation.
Hi, I just wanted to quickly run over some hygiene rules for the session before we let Aditi kickstart. You will have a Q&A tab on the bottom, which is where you can ask questions at any given point. And post Aditi's presentation, we will verbally take those questions and Aditi will answer them personally. The chat section, which you will see on the bottom as well, is where all the information that we just spoke about TIFA, about Sahapedia, about Aditi, is all listed here. So if you need any of that information, it's also available for you to read there. And the Q&A question, I hope you can see it down, and we'll continue with this after Aditi is done with her session. Aditi, over to you to start the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Trishna. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Yeah, okay. So before I start talking about this, just like a general disclaimer of sorts. This presentation itself was made for undergraduate students, which means it's a basic introduction to exhibition histories. Exhibition histories in itself is a very vast subject, and almost each of the topic that I talk about right now can be a presentation in itself. So we can't really do that right now. So I'm just going to brush over everything and just scratch the surface so that you get a little bit of perspective. Also, we won't look at objects separately, objects or artworks separately. We'll mostly look at arts and artworks in collection and their impact on history and cultures. Lastly, a lot of what I'm going to talk about right now comes from a very Western perspective. There are multiple reasons for this. First being the history of art and history of exhibitions in India is not very well chronicled. The second being that exhibition as a concept that we know of right now actually came to the country through the colony. And lastly, this is not my favorite one, is because I studied in a British institute, my perspectives are influenced from where I studied from. Although towards the end of this presentation, I will talk about Indian exhibition histories and Indian art history in general, but I'm still learning. So if any of you have any resources that I could refer to, please share it with me. We all know there's a great dearth thereof. Okay, so now, just to start with, getting a few things out of the way. An exhibition is an event at which objects such as paintings are shown to the public, a situation in which someone shows a particular skill or quality to the public, or the act of showing these things. A museum is a building where objects of historical, scientific, or artistic interest are kept. And a gallery is a room where these things could be kept for the purposes of selling it at times. So as you can see, these are quite self-explanatory, but they overlap here and there, but there's no harm sort of getting these definitions out of the way. An exhibit can be within a museum, within a gallery, independent of all of these things also. This is just so that everyone has a clearer picture before I start talking about things. Now, moving on to exhibition histories. So like I said before, exhibition histories in general haven't really been spoken about much as a part of history of art. In fact, they've been spoken about very recently over the last couple of decades. So they've not been very well chronicled over a long period of time. Just a couple of other definitions here. Like you see over here, there's history of art and there's visual culture, which although overlapping, but are quite different ways of looking at arts and objects from two different perspectives. Where the formal education of history of art comes from dividing it into moments in history. You have isms, you have cubism, modernism, things like that. Whereas visual culture looks at objects in particular and focuses on them. And somewhere in between, and visual culture is also very vast. It looks at everything from design to cinema to advertising to everything. Somewhere in between the two, we have exhibition histories. So moving on to some possible reasons as to why exhibition histories have not been very well chronicled over a long period of time. So exhibitions are neither stable nor collectible, and nor are they the front person. The people who have already worked in the in the cultural sector or in gallery spaces or in museum spaces know that it takes a village to put an exhibit across. Now, when it comes to history writing, this becomes a little convoluted because you don't know whom to attribute what to. Although there have been moments where important artists associated to exhibits or important historians associated to exhibits or important curators have come into the limelight because of a particular exhibit that they worked with, and hence bringing the exhibition to the forefront of exhibition history. Exhibitions are also very administrative. Again, anyone who has worked within the sector would know that there is a lot of work that goes behind making a room full of art that is not artistic at all. How do you chronicle that? How do you chronicle the frame within which some works of art fit? And most importantly, although making exhibitions is a lot of creative and artistic work, there is a lot of conjecture about whether or not it can still be talked about as artwork. So how do you write about it becomes a question. And the last point here is that a lot of works of art in history of art are compared to one another, especially through moments within history of art. How do you compare exhibitions? So the model of chronicling history of art does not necessarily work for chronicling exhibition histories entirely, which makes it slightly difficult. Apart from this, there is also some sets of inconsistencies over here. The first being, how do we contextualize exhibition history? Do we do it in a chronological fashion? If we do that, like I said before, the definition of exhibition has changed so much over the last so many years. Where do we start? Another way to go about it is typologically. But then again, how many types would you classify an exhibit into? Because all of these types would at some point sort of merge into one another and overlap. Having said all of this, it is still very important to talk about exhibition histories, but because it not only talks about the artworks or objects present in it, but also represents moments in history and very specific moments. If you think about it, a particular exhibition talks about a particular month, day, week within a particular year, and the socioeconomic, historic, and political background of that month, week, day, year. So it becomes very important to then talk about exhibit because it narrows down your perspective of the history through a collection of objects. So a good way to go about is to get exhibits that have been important to history of art. Now, how do you do that? How do you sort of pick out exhibits and point out which one of those are important to history of art? A good way to go about it is to see which ones, who did it first, is a good way of sort of looking at it, or is one of the most commonly used ways by historians. An example here is the Armory Show, which happened in New York, Chicago, and Boston in 1930. So the modern arts movement, the modernism movement, was sort of collected within a space and shown together across America for the first time. So all of these objects and works of art that happened over decades of a certain movement were collected in a certain space and then shown to multiple places within a country, hence making it important. It acts as an archive, or it acts as a resource, apart from also being an experience of an entire movement in history of art in the same space. Another example here is the Cubism and Abstract Art exhibition, which happened at MoMA in San Francisco. This specific exhibit showcased Cubism, showed what Cubism is to the entire fraternity and to the world, and hence established through it a movement in history of art. Thus making an exhibit a platform to push movements in history of art. Similarly, there is primary objects, which happened at the Jewish Museum in New York in 1966, which introduced minimalism to the world, and again acts as a platform to sort of showcase an entire moment in history of art. Now, contrary to all of these that I've spoken about earlier, we also have some exhibits which change the way we look at exhibits. So one of these is Magicians of the World. I'm not going to try to pronounce the French name because I'll be horrible at it, which happened at the Pompidou Center in Paris in 1989. So before this, most large-scale exhibitions or most large-scale exhibitions which were talked about only included works from the West, from the global West, which is Europe, the Americas, things like that. This was one of the first exhibits which sort of put works from the East and the West in the same space and then created a narrative around it. Although this too came with a bunch of problems in itself, a lot of representational issues, which we will eventually talk about later on in this presentation. Okay, so moving on, now I'm going to talk about exhibition history from the perspective of exhibition design. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the salon. Now, the Arts Academy in Paris royally sanctioned official art exhibitions, which started in 1667. As you can see over here, the artworks did not have any breathing space. They were put up as wallpapers. There was nothing separating two artworks, and no artwork was isolated. So it was sort of a mosaic of frames on a wall, which had works sort of merging into one another almost. But here there was a very important politics which led to what I'm going to talk about next, is that if you see in this image, the frame of vision of the human cuts at a particular point of time. So say, for example, if I'm a human in this room and I want to buy a work of art from the top, I may not be able to see it. So I may not buy it. So there's a whole lot of power that the authorities who did the display had over the artist because of this kind of display. There was a whole politics of who comes in the middle ground in the salon. This led to a very interesting point in exhibition histories and in history of art in general, is the dynamic between the artist and the curator. So I'm just going to start this with a story. Like the salon that we saw earlier, there was something called the Universal Exposition, which also happened in Paris. An artist called Gustave Courbet submitted 14 paintings for the show, and 3 of them were rejected for lack of space, which, if you think about it, is a very benign reason for rejection. So what he did was he organized something called a Pavilion of Realism, which was in the margins of the exposition in 1855. And above the entrance, he wrote Realism G. Courbet, exhibition of 40 paintings, and he also charged people to enter his separate exhibits. Now, coming back to what I was discussing earlier, curators as professionals have dominated the field of exhibition histories for a very long time. And exhibitions by artists are not historicized very extensively. But this is despite the fact that before the term curator was even professionalized, artists did this anyway. They would select their works, they would organize their works, they would generate financial models from their work. So this happened. They also determined conditions in which their work would go on display. So something that you would do on your Instagram right now. You know what you want to put up, you know where you want to put it up. So it's a personal form of curation which happened either way. But in around the 20th century, artists started doing this not just for themselves, but also collectively started doing this for other artists. And hence, artist-curated exhibitions became an important event which changed the way we looked at exhibitions. So it's a question what an exhibition is in itself and what you might count as an exhibition. Case in point is Duchamp's miniature box in a suitcase, which is a box containing miniature monographs, including 69 reproductions of the artist's own works. Now, this particular piece was a response to the ready-made movement and how reproductions of something can be curated. At the end of the day, it is not your typical, I put up pictures within a room, you come and see it situation. So how do you look at it? Do you consider it an exhibition? At the end of the day, it is a collection of objects. A more complicated version of this is something called an exhibit by Richard Hamilton and Victor Passmore, which happened at Hatton Gallery in Newcastle. It was an exhibition which had absolutely no images, just colored screens. And the artist specifically said that this exhibit has no subject, no theme other than itself. So what is an exhibit if it doesn't have anything, if it doesn't have any object, or is the exhibit an object in itself? How do you look at it? Taking this a step further, there was Yves Klein who made the Void. The Void was a space that was entirely painted white and treated as a regular gallery opening. There were tickets that were charged, people paid for this, there were critics who came, and it was treated like any other exhibit would. And this also led to a very important moment in history of exhibits, which I'll come to next. But then again, it came with a question as to what at all is an exhibition. So I would like you to sort of look at these two pictures very carefully, picture A and picture B. Ideally, I would ask questions to the audience at this point because I don't like keeping on and on without stopping and asking the audience to look at images. But since we can't do that anymore, I'm just going to point out the differences myself. So the image A has clean white walls, which means we cannot really tell from the image what the building is or where it is. And from here, what we can think about is what kind of context it creates for the work at display. And the last thing that we could think about is how do you experience this? And this must be very easy because a lot of exhibits at this point of time happen in this way. As opposed to that, the image on the right, image B, has colored walls with very distinct architectural features, which means if you know your craft or if you know where this is, you can see where this exhibit is. So this is from the National Gallery in London. And if you're a frequent visitor, you would see the picture and you would know what we're talking about. So you can sort of decipher why the images are here, who put them here, what the institution is. So you already have a context as opposed to the image on letter A, where you can't really decide the context. And at the same time, the experience of the exhibit in image B changes. So buildings like the National Gallery in London and many other museums and galleries made at that time, they were made in a specific style of architecture called the neoclassical style, which means they sort of replicated a lot of historical Greek and Roman temple architecture or political architecture, things like that. Now that's the presentation itself. But there is a lot of theory around how this was supposed to help govern the way an audience views the images or experiences the images within these structures. Similarly, there are similar sort of connotations for what I'm going to come to next, which is called the white cube. So the image A is what we now know as the white cube. Coming back to Yves Klein, the void was considered the beginning of white cube. It's supposed to be an ideal white space where you're supposed to see the art before the space. So the space is unrecognizable, but the art is what sort of shines. Essentially, nothing interferes with the art, and hence you're secularizing the art. But there's a lot of sort of criticism to that, and I personally sort of have issues with that sentiment, is that if you strip the exhibit of its context, it seems extremely artificial. You don't know what you're experiencing. And is the lack of context not context enough? There's also like a lot of other questions over there. Another sort of argument for this is that it allows art to have space to breathe. But that is a very never-ending how much space is enough question. So to exemplify this, I'm going to show you 3 images, which is 1, 2, and 3, all of which are decades apart. So this is from 2019, this is from 2010, and this is from 92, all of which you cannot really tell from the images or from the exhibit itself as to which time frame or where it belongs. And that has a lot to do with the way the white cube is designed. Now, again, the white cube in itself is a whole other presentation, but this is the basis of it. A lot of organizations, a lot of galleries right now use the white cube space as a model to exhibit works. Although in the last couple of years, there has been a very refreshing change to this as to how gallerists and museums and organizations are moving more towards narrative fashion, more towards immersive exhibits, and technology is really helping with that. And how do you sort of give a certain space context and then make the works of art or make the objects shine? Yeah. So okay, moving on from that. Now that we've spoken a lot about the history of exhibition design, I want to sort of diverge a little and talk about typology a little bit. So I'm going to touch upon Biennale just for a bit because I want to move on to representation within exhibitions because that is a very important aspect of exhibition histories. Now, we all know, I hope we all know what Biennales is. Biennales are events where a collection of artworks from across the globe, or at times across countries or continents, get together once in 2 years. Kochi Biennale from India has become very popular recently. The first Biennale and one of the most popular ones even now is the Venice Biennale. The first one was organized in 1895, and it was sort of a format where multiple kinds of artwork were shown on the same platform, sort of a world fair for the arts. Now, coming down a couple of centuries, the London Institute of Art in 1950s coined something called contemporary exhibits. Now, contemporary in its definition itself means now. So the Biennale model sort of picked up from this and sort of used the contemporary as a model in the sense that all works of art happening right now across the globe are going to be put together in this one space, and hence making it very instrumental in the idea of representation. So if you see here, this is the Venice Biennale map from 1952. You see pavilions for Austria, Italy. You see an artist pavilion for Picasso. You see a pavilion for Belgium. So each country or each artist or each organization is representing themselves, which makes what I'm going to talk about next very important, this cultural identities and exhibition histories. So, like I said earlier, exhibits not only talk about artworks, but also talks about notions or socioeconomic struggles or political climate or cultural climate of any particular point of time, hence making identity and representation a very important aspect of exhibition history. So I'm going to talk about two exhibits here. The first being primitivism. So primitivism as a term in itself is problematic in many ways, mostly because of colonial ideas of what is primitive, what is civilized, and then, the whole narrative around that. Having said that, within the world of history of art in the 20th century, there was an exhibit called Primitivism, which literally was an exhibit of 150 works of modern art alongside 200 what they called tribal objects. Now, this was very heavily criticized, and one of the main reasons of this is, say you're putting up a Picasso on one wall and attributing that work to Picasso. And on the next wall, you're putting up work by, again, a word used in a very strange fashion in colonial books, artisan. You put work by artisan next to it and don't attribute it to any human being. There's a whole sort of lot of questions of how you represent the work. why have you not attributed it to anyone? And this happened as late as 1984. So as a response to this came Magicians of the World, which we briefly touched upon earlier. So Magicians of the World was supposed to be a response to primitivism. Half of the curated works were by Western artists, while the other half were by artists from what they called emerging countries, and what we now understand as developing countries. Out of the 50 artists from emerging countries, works of 4 Indian artists were displayed: Raja Babu Sharma, Acharya Vyakul, Boa Devi, Jangar Singh Shyam. Apart from this, the yellow spiral logo that you saw earlier were also made by an Indian artist from Bhopal, who eventually sort of dropped out of the exhibition. I'm just going to talk about a couple of works here. So let's look at Boa Devi's work. Boa Devi is described in the catalogue as in Mithila, Indian women decorate earthen walls of their homes with frescoes. Boa Devi has developed an original style for themes she always extracts from the mythological cycle of Ramayana. Beautiful work, but what happens when you remove the wall from the house? What happens to representation then? So there was a lot of talk, a lot of criticism that even though it came from best intentions, but Magicians of the World faced a lot of criticism about how work is displayed. How do you contextualize any particular kind. Okay, moving on. Now from here, I think it's a good time to start talking about Indian exhibition histories. So display culture and exhibitions as we understand them right now were introduced to India through colonization. And I would like to be clear here, this is only exhibitions as we know them now. There are many things that we probably don't consider as exhibitions. Like, for example, if I were to make pottery and put it up in my kitchen, would that still be exhibition? So there is a whole lot of issues with that over here. Again, it is unchronicled and it's non-cohesive the way it has been chronicled in Indian exhibition histories. One of the oldest museums in India is supposed to be the Indian Museum in Calcutta, which was established in 1814 by the Asiatic Society of Bengal. So I'm going to talk about this in 3 sections. One is pre-independence. I'm just going to touch upon Victorian sort of attitudes towards exhibition histories in India, because it sort of pushed the country into a particular direction with history of art. So Indian arts were promoted by Anglo-Indian, South Asians and British in 19th and 20th century. This mostly included what was commonly termed by colonial authorities as industrial art over fine art, and there was a whole sort of issue with high art and low art over there. It was coined industrial art by a gentleman called George C.M. Birdwood in a book titled The Industrial Arts of India, which was published in 1884. From here came something called the Colonial and Indian Exhibition, which happened at South Kensington. It started in 1886. Now, the Industrial Arts of India sort of manual was instrumental with this, because it sort of pushed Indian arts to a point where it sort of started being considered in exhibitions. A part of this colonial and Indian exhibition was something called Twixt East and West. Now, Twixt East and West was a section at the colonial and Indian exhibition which had a replica of Old London on one side, like you can see on the screen. On one side, there's a replica of Old London, and one replica of Gwalior Gateway from India on the other side. Now, there were issues with this. It has been well documented that the gateway was modified without historical accuracy. There were motifs and elements in the gateway which were represented here, which did not exist in the real gateway. And the second issue that was talked about a lot was, again, what happens when you remove the gateway and put it upon display like this from its original context. Another element here was a part of this exhibition was also people. So people from rural India were sort of put on exhibit as a part of the Twixt East and West exhibit also, which also has a bunch of connotations, which is a paper and a presentation in itself. So this sort of pushed a certain idea of Indian art history being associated or being represented through the colonial gaze in a certain way. And moving on, it sort of lingered for a certain amount of time. Say, for example, post-independence, one of the first exhibits that happened from India was the one called India Through the Ages, which was displayed in 47-48 at Burlington House and then at Rashtrapati Bhavan. It brought together classical Indian painting and sculpture with examples of 20th century art made in India. Now, this also represented works from both East and West. Again, I have absolutely no archival image of this. If anyone has it, please do share it with me. Another important exhibit post-independence was the Triennale India, which started in 1968. India hosted its first Triennale then. It showcased trends and works from across the world. It was a significant international initiative, and it was organized by Lalit Kala Academy, and it happened every 3 years. The last one was done last year in I think in December or in November, something like that. Okay, so this is where I'm going to stop now. After this, if I have to talk about what is happening in India right now, like I said before, there is a whole range of innovation when it comes to exhibitions in this country that is happening as we speak. The entire game hasn't been as innovative and as interesting as it is right now. And that's mostly because we are moving from looking at exhibits as collections of objects to looking at them as tools for narrative building. So we've slowly, one organization after the other, we're sort of moving towards looking at, exhibits as not just something that is a record of things, but also a mode to sort of speak to people, tell stories to people. And there's also the intervention of technology at this point of time. Immersion has become a very important aspect of exhibitions in the country and across the world, in fact. I feel like a lot of people feel it is more important to have immersive work so as to keep your visitor, so as to serve your visitor in a certain way, which is fantastic because at the end of the day, you exhibit for the visitor. Yeah, to sum all of this up, I'm just going to leave you with a question. So this is an image of a project called An Architecture, which was a collaboration between Gordon Meta Clark and Le Corbusier. So Meta Clark was a trained architect who is known for his work called Building Cuts. And this particular work, where he went around New York and broke some buildings apart, was his idea of rejection of architectural profession. There have been a lot of conversation about whether or not this is an exhibit. Is this an exhibit? Is the photo an exhibit? Are neither of them exhibits? Are both of them exhibits? So I honestly don't have a right answer here. And I would like to leave this with you to sort of think about it and see, because maybe the presentation might help you with it. Okay, that's it. I'm done. Over to you, Trishna.
Yes, hi Aditi. Thank you so much for the presentation. That was really insightful overviewing it. So I'm quite excited that we got to open this out to multiple people. Just to a note to the audiences, please do feel free to ask the questions in the Q&A tab below. I see that some of them have started coming in and we will take them just shortly. I'm going to start, Aditi, with a quick question from our end. And I know it's a space that you've been thinking about and also that we work together with at TIFA, is as we're seeing these new models of exhibitions develop, where is the need for interactivity, not just immersion from a technology perspective, but how is interactivity being played out?
So interactivity has become, like I said before, it's sort of moving from, I might get into trouble for saying this, but it's sort of moving from serving the organization to serving the audience. There's a very like short but like, you know, significant shift in that perspective. The thing is, at the end of the day, you don't, as a space or as an exhibit, you don't want to come across as intimidating. That's the last thing you would like to come across as, right? So how do you gauge attention? How do you keep it? And immersion is only a part of immersion. I feel like is a step into sort of grabbing the attention, and interactivity is to keep the attention. That's what that's how I sort of look at it. And I feel like with immersion, interactivity becomes a little hand in hand. I don't think anything can become fully immersive if it is not interactive enough. So yeah, I feel like anyone who is attempting immersion at this point of time is attempting alongside interactivity. Yeah.
Okay, super. Sorry, I was just unmuting myself. Let's take a question from the audience. So this is asked by Sarah Kaushik. When did, and if it did, the use of the term crafts happen in the Indian exhibition scene?
Okay. So,
which I think is very interesting, and I know there's multiple perspectives that you.
Yeah, I'm going to have fun with this question. So, I'm sorry, I didn't get the name.
Sorry, unmuting. Sarah Kaushik. She's also an exhibition designer.
Oh, okay, great. Hi, Sarah. So I'm actually trying to write a PhD on this. It's a very, very lengthy subject. I can't put a finger on the date or the year, to be very honest. It is heavily sort of linked with Victorian ideas of high art and low art, if you've read about it or if you know about it. So painting or sculpting or formal forms of art being high art, and anything that can be utilized, anything that has utilitarian value, becoming low art from a colonial perspective. So there's multiple sets of literature, around this, but I can't really put a finger on it. I can't put a finger on the year. I'm still trying. And that's where the idea of crafts comes. So it also has a lot of economic connotations, if you think about it, in the sense that if you call something not formal enough on a large scale as the colonizer, you can put a less price on it, and then you can sell it. You can buy it for a less price and sell it for a higher price when you go back. So there's a lot of different perspectives of looking at this. There's also an element of pedagogy over here, in the sense that the schools, these art schools during the colony specifically taught works from European masters, and a sort of South Asian work or Southeast Asian work or work from the global South was not even touched about for maybe centuries, if not decades at least. So there's multiple connotations to this, in the sense that this what you know of right now as a community, and I'm talking about the community back then, and in some sense even now, we have very rich histories of karigari. We have very rich histories of ritualistic art, utilitarian art. Uh, but then it was sort of like, but even I feel like even linking it to just a movement in colonized India would be too simplistic. I feel like this is a very long answer and it's a very long sort of conversation, but these are some perspectives that I have about it.
Okay, great. So we'll have the next question, which is a question by Saurabh. Doesn't avoiding the white cube, and the question is also up on the screen for anyone who needs it. Doesn't avoiding the white cube and putting the exhibits in a context run the risk of exhibiting in itself getting submerged in the context? Also, specifically in fine art, how important are the inherent qualities of an exhibition as compared to the context so as to affect the decision of displaying in a wine cube space or a contextual space? Again, I think beautiful question. Thank you,
Very
Saurabh.
nice question. Yeah.
It's something that we've grappled with at TIFA very often, but over to Aditi to share.
Yeah, so Trishla and I have had this conversation multiple times. Um, there is no issue with uh, cleaning the context up, is something that I would like to clarify offhand. If that is your stand with representing your work, that is great. But in terms of, okay, a lot of literature about the white cube, and the literature has come from a bunch of surveys and research that happened when the white cube actually started, is that the white cube comes across from a viewer perspective as cold. It comes across as if every single thing from walking around. So there's a specific type of flooring. Most of the time, there's a specific type of flooring which makes a very distinct kind of noise. So if you run or kids run in the white cube, someone will know of it. So there's that element of it. Outside of that, when you talk about the importance of inherent qualities of an exhibit and the context, I feel like this depends a lot on the artist's perspective of their works also. And here I'm assuming the artist is the curator. Because see, at times, and I've seen this from my practice as well, at times what happens is that you would like for your painting to hang under a tree, or you would like your painting to be at a building like TIFA, or you would like to not have walls when you display your work. At the same time, some artists also enjoy sort of, this is it, focus on my work, and look at it. So this is sort of a two-edged sword from my end, in the sense that I feel like if it is a very conscious decision to put up a certain kind of work in a white cube space, that's fine, because that is you are establishing your context consciously. But if it is not, then I feel like the context does establish a lot of elements of why you're exhibiting in a particular space, whom you're exhibiting for, who is helping you out with the exhibit, things like that. So in terms of like chronicling an exhibit, just from the perspective of like exhibition histories, it becomes very interesting to look at, I can look at this image and I can tell who all has worked on this particular exhibit, as opposed to a white cube space. At the same time, I don't know, I feel like I have a very strong bias against the white cube space, because I personally feel like it sort of strips the painting or strips the work of art of any kind of context at all. Yeah, I think that's what I have to say about that.
Okay, super. Thank you so much. We'll take the next two questions, which I'm going to kind of merge into one question, which is by Naisargi Korat. Sorry if I'm pronouncing it very badly, Naisargi. And also by, sorry, just a second. I think Aparna. These are the two questions that we have. How do you think the idea of exhibitions and museums are going to change, especially given the current context where we might not be able to publicly go in proximity to each other. And it's also interlinking with Ninad's question is what is the new idea of these physical spaces and how it's going to evolve. And the new question that kind of links this in is what are the new trends in exhibition design in museums, especially in India?
Okay, I would have had a different answer last month, to be very honest. I have a very different answer right now. A part of it is no one knows, because everyone is trying to sort of adapt to going virtual in a certain sense, because no one knows when people will be able to physically go and experience spaces. At the same time, there is this whole conversation happening about uh, going virtual or becoming digital is a resource building exercise, but is it an experience in itself? How immersive can it be? And honestly, even the best of practitioners don't have answers to this, because we're all learning as we go. In this situation, I feel like the this particular situation with COVID-19 has uh, pushed us into the far end of something we started. We sort of started dipping into the pool of going digital. We started dipping into the pool of becoming slightly virtual. We've started looking at, uh, how can digital curation and digital exhibits and virtual tools and things like these, how can they become immersive in themselves? How do we turn them into an experience? We had just started to figure it out, and now we're in the far end of the pool. So now we have to figure it out. I think the new trend per se is not going to be a trend. I think the new way of looking at exhibition design is going to be geography non-specific. I think we're going more and more in a direction where exhibits are not going to depend on you to be physically there to view it. And at the same time, on the counterpart of this, there is also going to be a lot of, because every single time something like this happens, industrialization come romanticization, right? So every single time you're pushed into a far end of like a newer technology, there is going to be a counter, movement to that, in the sense spaces which inherently believe in physical experiences, inherently believe in sort of, active visits, will double down on that as soon as this opens. So I feel like this is how it's going to go forward, in the sense that we're trying to figure out how to make the whole virtual thing work for us. And at the same time, people who think and feel and know that something they do is so tactile that it has to be visited, it has to be touched, it has to be felt, will sort of move in that direction also. And at some point, this will sort of, collide. Hopefully, I'm hoping for it to sort of collide at some point and, make something that is a good sort of balanced mixture of the two.
Okay, super. Just to kind of prod further, are there any examples or case studies of online exhibitions that we've started to see and that you have noticed? I know there are some where galleries are using a platform to exhibit and show online spaces. A lot of biennales are exploring it. Also, there are a lot of virtual spaces, and VR and AR will become prominent mediums in the way that this is taken forward. So just wanted to know if there are any platforms or case studies that you can share with our participants here. Also, sorry, just to add, a lot of the platforms that I have seen personally are quite limiting to the 2D. So the 3D or the dimensionality within the digital space is still not something that we're seeing. It's also because maybe the infrastructure of the backend is more complicated to develop, but over to you.
Yeah, okay. So I can't really think of a consolidated, resource for this. Maybe I can make a resource and share it with everyone, and maybe it can go out in the email. Is that all right? Because I really can't think of.
Yes, that's absolutely fine. Yeah. Okay, so we have the next two questions, which are again all very exciting questions. The first one is by Sheena. Why is decolonization not addressed or actively informing exhibitions or art itself in India? And the next one is by Aparna, which I think it's Aparna, sorry. Why is there a negative connotation around the word artisan? And how essentially you can interlink art and artisan, artist and artisan, but it's not really looked at in the same way.
Yes, both really interesting questions. I'm going to talk about the artisan bit first. So this has a lot of history attached to it. Like I said before, it comes from a very Victorian idea of so I'll tell it to you in the simplest way I know. There is this whole Victorian idea of formal art and informal art, or industrial art and fine art, or high art and low art, whatever you want to call it, right? So anyone who makes art which is utilized is considered, or was historically coined, an artisan. Okay. Now you've taught this. British schools have taught this over centuries in Indian art schools, and generations of Indian students have learned this and sort of inherited it. So there is a lot of, at what point did we stop and question ourselves? Okay, why do we look at it like this? Why do we look at, and then there's also examples of exhibitions like primitivism, where you specifically call out things as tribal arts. Isn't it all arts? It's small events like this which sort of like add up to centuries later. Right now, we look at artisans and arts as like separate things, or objects and artworks as separate things, or art and craft as separate things, and things like that. The only way to go about it, and now I will move on to the next question, the only way to go about it is sort of to address it as a community ourselves. And I'm not just saying from the artist community, I'm not just saying from like an organizational perspective, I'm also talking about it from the perspective of a viewer, from the perspective of just an audience. How do you respond to, someone making pottery versus someone making digital art? What connotations do you as a viewer give to specific types of art or specific mediums is something that we need to address. This is a very important aspect, I feel, of decolonization, which I think some art schools are addressing it. But there again, the issue here is there is no consolidated set of information that people, all of what I've spoken to you about right now has come from multiple different, resources sort of clubbed together because I actively looked out for it. But there is nothing for, the 18-year-old art student to collectively look at once and go, okay, this is why we look at things in a particular way. So a very important aspect of like decolonizing becomes how to see things, how to be an audience of artworks, how to be an audience of an exhibit. How do you look at things and how do you assign values to them? Do you judge artwork? How do you judge artwork? Do you critique it? Do you criticize it? How do you go about it? How do you associate it with the maker of the artwork? All of these things I feel like need to be not only addressed by art schools, that is of course very important, but also it needs to be addressed by organizations, people who make exhibitions happen, people who make art for exhibitions, and very importantly, the viewer. The more the viewer sort of, goes back and thinks about, okay, why am I looking at this and feeling this way about it, the more, it clears off over time. Yeah, so that's what I have to say about that.
How has the idea of display evolved in India? And that's kind of interlinked with how is our understanding, because you mentioned colonizers and most of the Indian museums were set up during the British era. Yeah. How is that kind of colonial trauma staying with us even today, which is quite interlinked to your previous question? And then leading into that, that's a question by Shambhavi. And then leading into that is a question by Nishita, which essentially discusses that there is a certain accessibility within the museums that we talk about today. It's still for a certain class, it's still for a certain audience per se. So when we are looking at being more accessible or talking about audiences at large, who are these people? And what are the kind of moves that can be made so that it's not so kind of biased, which very definitely it is today.
Hmm. Okay. Colonial hangovers is a very, very sort of significant part of display culture in this country right now. Um, I actually had a conversation about this with someone today itself, in the sense that how just the smallest of things, for example, looking at museums, like I said in my presentation, we're moving from looking at museums from being collections of objects to looking at them as narrative building tools, right? But looking at museums as collections of objects is also comes from a Victorian perspective. It's a very British perspective. So, like Trishna said, a lot of the big museums that we speak about right now were established during the colonial era, and it sort of carries that with this. It's of course it's going to share a little bit year after year after year and decade after decade after decade. Uh, Despite that, it's carrying some centuries with it right now. So uh, you can't really expect it to sort of go away within the first couple of decades of us sort of having autonomy over this process. Also, there is an element of, I personally feel like the element of us not having a consolidated history of art. Like one of my biggest qualms about studying abroad, I love I love studying abroad, but one of my biggest sort of issues with it is that I learned all of these lessons, okay, and everything in the Western history of art was sort of confined in these boxes, which is easy to grasp and easy to understand and sort of very palatable. I have nothing like that in Indian art. Just I feel like just working on collectively, and I feel like people are working on it collectively, and having that in itself is a step towards just shedding a little bit of that hangover, because we still sort of try to um, push ourselves or push Indian history of art in those boxes. We try to push it into cubism, we try to push it into modernism and things like that. But do we really need to? Can we not sort of re-examine, history of Indian art from a very colloquial, vernacular context? Coming to the question of accessibility, I completely agree. There is a huge accessibility issue with museums everywhere, all across the world. Museums deal with the issue of accessibility, and that is because museums have been looked at. Uh, you know, there's so many things. There's things like um, how you can't really go too close to a piece of work, which is fine. Of course, it's an old piece of work. You can't really go too close to it. You can't speak too loudly. You can't really have discussions really loudly. So there's a very interesting piece on the white cube which talks about how the white cube does not even allow you to think out loud because you feel like someone's always watching. That is a very small but I feel significant part of accessibility. And again, I feel like newer organizations and the idea of digitality. This is why I feel like digitality becomes very interesting, because the idea of digitality on some level democratizes things a little. There is still the element of language inclusivity, because digital exhibitions and digital platforms are still predominantly English speaking. So how do we sort of become inclusive of non-English speaking audiences, non-English reading audiences and things like that. So that is still an issue, but I feel like it's sort of a little bit of a stepping stone into democratizing the whole game a little bit.
Super. Just to take the next question, we're actually going to take it from Aarti. And Aarti asks, again, beautiful question. I'm really excited by what we're getting today. Is how is the use of text and language in exhibition changing over time from wall text, catalog making, generally writing about art as opposed to writings as art? Is art writing really explored as an area in Indian context? And again, Aditi and I have had many discussions and we've kind of played with also different formats at TIFA, but over to Aditi to share more insights.
Yeah. So this is a very important aspect of accessibility as well. Um, how I know I can't address this to people, maybe people can raise their hands, but how often have you gone to a museum, read a wall text and not understood anything about the museum? Like, it happens. I've studied history of art, it still happens to me. I don't know, maybe it's either I'm stupid or like it's an issue with the way things are written. Uh, I feel like there is a certain sense of evolution, in the sense that we are trying to become, because see, when you move these things to, say for example, I have an image which I want to post on Instagram, I cannot use the same language as I did on my wall text, right? So I will tweak it a little bit, uh, and that is again is a little bit of a stepping stone into sort of, I'm not saying underestimate your audience. That is not what this is about. I'm just saying certain things are written and spoken about in a way which honestly is very difficult to grasp for the best of people. Like, even for the most, well-read people, it becomes really, really difficult for them to sort of read certain catalogs and read certain. So then it becomes, whom are you serving? Are you serving the organization or are you serving your audience? Because if it were truly audience serving, then the organization would slowly move towards making, writing about art more and more accessible. There is also an element, like I said before, also an element of language over here, in the sense that if I were to do a show in Pune, uh, I would love to write a little bit about it in Marathi, but I can't because I learned history of art in English. So I feel like if you're asking me how things are changing, I think we're addressing this. We are addressing the fact that there is an issue here on not just personal levels, but also on organization levels. I know of quite a few many organizations who are now moving towards sort of, making their text more accessible, making their text available in multiple languages, making writing about art generally more accessible. And then there is the question of writing as art and art writing. Okay, a really good example here would be, there's an artist that TIFA also very regularly works with, and I worked with for the last festival that I did, which was called Futures of Sexuality. His name is Chaitanya Modak. Now, Chaitanya in his works with type a lot. And he once said, I don't know if I write or if I draw letters. And that is a very interesting way to sort of look at this. So I feel like it comes from, if that is what you're asking about, then I feel like it comes from very personal sort of artistic perspective. But if you're writing about writing as art in terms of, me writing about work of art or anyone writing about a work of art as an art in itself, then I don't really know. I feel like there are multiple ways of looking at it. You can either, be purely audience serving and write so that, things are palatable, or you can treat it um, as a piece of art, like you said, and then it doesn't matter. It depends. I feel like it depends on what is the purpose behind writing about art. Considering we are speaking so much about accessibility, I feel like uh, both sides of the coin are equally important. I feel like, yes, there is a certain kind of writing for art which is very poetic, and I enjoy reading it a lot, and which is very poetic and very beautiful and nice to read. But at the same time, there is also the objective, dry, collected version of it, which most people understand, which is also important. So yeah, I feel like that's how the changing is sort of happening in that, because we are now slowly understanding what is working and what is not working. So we're trying to fix that one wall text at a time.
Um, Thank you, Aditi. Just to jump in here, there is a fantastic resource that I'd like to mention that was, Aditi knows, it's one of my favorite documents. It's a resource by Kochi and Prohilvesha, which was made together, I think, in the 2016 edition, which essentially introduces art mediation. So it's a toolkit for art mediation. So what are different games that you can play? What are different ways in which you can mediate? Because the wall text has a certain role to play, but there are also many different things that can be done in and around the artwork that can help mediation of the artwork, which is the transference of the knowledge that the artwork is trying to convey to making it easier for it to be said in a certain sense. So I think it's available online, or the link of it is available online. So please do have a look. In the interest of time, we are going to take our last question right now. And I know some of you have raised your hands, but unfortunately, the design of this webinar is such that we cannot make it interactive at this given point of time. So we do, as much as we appreciate that you do want to speak and to make this a conversation, unfortunately, is not possible at this time. Before I take the last question, I'd quickly like to mention to you some of the upcoming programs that are happening at TIFA. We have a Meet the Curator session where we have five curators from all different parts of the world. I will be speaking from the Indian perspective, but we have someone from the Gulf, someone from Africa, someone from Vietnam, and someone from South Africa, who will be speaking on different perspectives and curation in different parts of their countries. That is one session that's going to be at the end of May. We also have a session on Indian art history, a two-part session, which is looking at antiquities and also modern and contemporary art, which is coming up at the end of this month, on the 22nd and the 23rd, with Keshav Mahendru. So please look out for both of those, as they will be announced shortly. As a last question, I think this is a beautiful question by Sarah to kind of take it ahead, Aditi. To what extent, in your opinion, does theater and exhibition design overlap? And I know in a context like India, where we are still working in kind of segregated circles of visual arts, theater, dance, and as TIFA, we know there are also the challenges of being in attempting to be at this point a multidisciplinary space. Where do you see those kind of interactions or multidisciplinary forms coming into play?
I feel like there is a huge overlap, firstly. Mostly because, like Trishla said, a lot of exhibits are now, for the lack of a better term, just getting off the wall. Like almost everyone is now just getting off the wall and trying to use, the three-dimensional space that is in between the walls. I feel like as art becomes more sort of understanding and more inclusive of all the types and ways in which it can exist, there are overlaps are bound to happen, and they're always going to be beautiful to experience. Theater and exhibition design as elements in themselves have a lot of similarity, because at the end of the day, we are talking about space here. And I feel like we're talking about experiential space here. Although they cater to very specific forms of experiences, I feel like theater is also now getting down from the stage. Like art is getting down from, like visual art is getting down from the walls. And in the process of doing that, I feel like they are meeting somewhere in between, like, in the middle of the room, something like that. And hence the overlap, specifically in terms of, if I have to talk about this from the perspective of it being, sorry, from a technical perspective, theater and exhibition design have one very thing in common, is that it is space design for an experience, right? In terms of other overlaps, is that both of these elements are trying to become more immersive. And I feel like the last part of it is, I feel like theater and exhibition in themselves are redefining themselves. You know, one act at a time, one exhibition at a time. They're sort of redefining themselves a little by little, and hence on some level making room to, you know, merge into each other. And I think that like, you know, spaces like TIFA do this really well, in the sense that it's not a black box, it's not a white cube, but it's sort of all into one. It's sort of, you know, one space where any kind of work can happen. It can be anything from, you know, having a VR video game to having a theater performance, to having a theater performance inside a VR video game, and you know, you get the gist of it. So when work is moving in this sense, when work is becoming so flexible from across artworks, I feel like overlaps are bound to happen, and overlaps will happen more so often as we keep going forward. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Aditi. Thank you. We really appreciate you continuing our journey even after you're not fully full-time with TIFA, but still continuing this. Thank you everyone for joining this session. It would be lovely if in your own spaces you could do a little clap for Aditi. So sending virtual energies and happy thank yous to Aditi all across the country. We're a little bit puzzled by how abruptly most of these Zoom chats end. So we would love for you to be connected to us. Please write to us. Please share feedback. You'll be getting an email with the video of this webinar and also a feedback link. So please do share feedback with us. And we hope to see you for the following sessions. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the chat section if you want to reread anything or reread any of the questions. And we're going to close with a song by Kokoroko called Tide. So enjoy that, and you can take your time to sign out. Thank you. Good evening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.